Picture this for a second. You open your eyes in the morning. Servants are already drawing you a warm, perfectly scented bath, your breakfast is being prepared, and right out the window, a massive vineyard is being tended to by people you literally own. So, what did it actually feel like to be rich in the ancient world? Was it all just quiet luxury and lounging around on fancy marble chairs all day? Well, the truth is, it was anything but quiet. It was actually a terrifying, highly performative, and just utterly exhausting reality.
Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to completely strip away all those romanticized myths of ancient history. Our goal today is to really unpack the exhausting, the beautiful, and honestly, the sometimes violent historical reality of ancient extreme wealth. We're going to look at what it really took to maintain your status in a world where everything you had could be taken from you in an absolute instant.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here's our agenda for today. First, we'll look at the theater of mornings, then engineering elite environments, followed by dining and bloody entertainment. After that, we've got the architecture of bodies, the paranoia of power, and finally, the invisible foundation. Section 1. The theater of mornings, performing power before dawn.
You see, if you were a wealthy Roman senator, your day kicked off with something called the salutatio. Every single morning, hundreds, and if you were really a heavy hitter, thousands of clients would line up outside your home in the pitch dark. These were folks who totally depended on your political favor, and you just stand there, essentially holding court in your robe. You'd grant requests, hand out little baskets of food or coins, and basically just absorb their flattery. This massive crowd was a very physical, very exhausting follower count. In Rome, this wasn't just casual socializing. No, this was the raw math of your political influence. Now, what's really fascinating here is how these morning routines across different empires were all these intense theatrical obligations. In ancient Egypt, for instance, wealthy nobles spent a solid 45 minutes applying elaborate makeup, specifically kohl, around their eyes. But hey, this wasn't vanity. It was actually spiritual protection against the evil eye and infections. It was an act of hardcore religious piety. Over in Babylon, a rich merchant would start his day by shouting formal prayers to his own personal, full-time deity, just hoping that God would advocate for him in the divine bureaucracy. So across the whole ancient world, being rich meant waking up to immediate, extremely high-stakes networking.
Moving on to Section 2. Engineering elite environments, curating reality.
So once the morning rituals wrapped up, elites spent their days in completely curated environments. Take the Roman domus, for example. These homes weren't just places to sleep, they were aggressive arguments made in stone about power and control. The architecture literally manipulated the psychology of anyone walking in. You'd enter through this dark, incredibly narrow corridor, which then opened up super dramatically into the atrium. This was a massive central hall flooded with blinding light from an opening in the roof, bouncing off a reflecting pool called the impluvium. Everything was explicitly orchestrated to make your jaw drop right on command. It told you exactly who was in charge from the second you walked through the door. But true wealth meant taking it even further. It meant literally transcending nature. In Babylon, elites engineered these crazy multi-story roof gardens, forcing water uphill in a dry climate for no other reason than to prove they had the engineering chops and the enslaved labor to actually pull it off. In Egypt, they'd paint their ceilings to perfectly mimic the night sky and their floors to look like lush gardens. And back in Rome, they used trompe-l'oeil frescoes, called topia, to create optical illusions of larger rooms and just a perpetual, never-ending summer. If you were genuinely rich, your environment reminded you every single day that you were an exceptional being who could curate your own reality.
Section 3. Dining and bloody entertainment, the performance of excess. Let's see how this builds as the day turns into evening. This is where dining and massive spectacles became arenas of just absolute, almost comical excess. The Roman banquet, or cena, was way more than a meal. It was a high-stakes performance. First of all, you reclined on couches, because sitting upright, yeah, that was for servants. And the food was purely designed to flex on your guests. If you look at the ancient cookbook of Apicius, dishes included literal brain-stuffed dormice, sauces made out of flamingo tongues, snails fattened up on milk until they couldn't even fit inside their own shells, and sea urchins completely drowning in garum, which is a really pungent fermented fish sauce. This brilliantly shows how the food itself wasn't really about tasting good. It was all about demonstrating rarity and an overwhelming, absurd level of complexity.
But the real social weapon at these dinner parties? That was the wine. Roman hosts would actually serve 3 completely different qualities of wine to 3 different tiers of guests, all sitting at the exact same table.
The top-tier VIP guests got the finest aged vintages, while the lower-ranked guests were stuck drinking cheap, watered-down swill. It was a brutal, completely in-your-face reminder of exactly where you stood in the social pecking order, and trust me, the guests definitely noticed.
Beyond the dining room, entertainment was public, it was physical, and it was wildly expensive. The Roman elite funded massive gladiatorial games and chariot races just to buy the public's loyalty. To really give you an idea of the scale of this economy, there was a famous ancient Roman charioteer named Gaius Appuleius Diocles. Over his career, he earned the modern equivalent of $5 billion. $5 billion. He was absolutely adored by the 250,000 fans packing the Circus Maximus, but at the end of the day, he was really just a high-return political branding tool for the mega-wealthy man who bought his horses.
This brings us to Section 4, the architecture of bodies, the ultimate project.
Now, with all this very public displaying and dining, you obviously had to look the part. For the ancient elite, the body was the ultimate project, and maintaining it required a literal army of humans. Let's walk through the daily Roman bath. If you were truly wealthy, you had a private bath complex right inside your home. You would meticulously move from a cold pool to a warm room to a sweltering hot room. Then came the massages, the extensive hair plucking by highly specialized slaves, and finally, getting your skin scraped totally clean with a curved metal tool called a strigil. An elite's entire existence revolved around being maintained by other human beings, whose sole purpose in life was to care for your physical form.
And the beauty standards of the time were absolutely wild. Remember that scraping tool I just mentioned, the strigil? Well, the grime, the oil, and the sweat scraped right off the bodies of famous gladiators was actually bottled up and sold to the elite. It was basically ancient celebrity merch. People would rub it onto their skin for beauty or for good luck. No way, right? Or take Cleopatra. It said she bathed in donkey milk to maintain her skin, which was a daily routine that required milking up to 700 donkeys. They went to alarming, truly extreme lengths just to preserve their physical image.
Section 5. The paranoia of power. Acute structural instability.
So the absolutely crucial point we need to understand is that none of this was purely for fun. Beneath the flamingo tongues and the daily massages, being rich in the ancient world was actually terrifying. You see, wealth back then was acutely structurally unstable. There was no bankruptcy protection. There were no diversified stock portfolios. If your merchant ship sank in a storm, you were completely ruined. If the emperor suddenly decided he didn't like you, your property was gone. Let's compare this. Today, a solid reputation is built steadily, over time. But Roman fama, that was something you had to actively maintain constantly, at a tremendous expense. If you stopped throwing banquets or sponsoring games for even one single season, you could lose your social identity forever. They were so obsessed with display because it was a desperate insurance policy against total ruin.
Over in ancient Egypt, this deep paranoia extended well beyond the grave. Wealthy Egyptians actually managed their massive anxiety through intense estate planning for the afterlife. Just look at Ramesses II. He started building his tomb the exact moment he took the throne. 67 years later, he was still adding to it. He spent the equivalent of a modern nation's entire infrastructure budget on his bureaucracy of death. Nailing down the administration of the afterlife was a relentless, highly obsessive project that consumed literal decades.
The Roman philosopher Seneca, who was himself extraordinarily wealthy, once noted, "The rich are often the most anxious people I know." The famous Stoic philosophy of the Roman elite wasn't just some fun intellectual exercise to pass the time. It was basically a psychological technology. It was a vital coping mechanism to manage the specific crushing stress of knowing that absolutely everything you owned could be instantly and violently ripped away from you.
Section 6. The invisible foundation, the human cost.
And now, we absolutely must address the invisible foundation of all this luxury. Because every single bath drawn, every flamingo tongue perfectly prepared, every elaborate toga folded, and every massive stone moved was made entirely possible by one horrific structural reality. 4,116. That is the exact number of enslaved human beings listed quite literally as property in the will of a single Roman man named Caecilius Isidorus. And get this, that was after he had already lost a massive chunk of his fortune. The entire architecture of ancient luxury was completely built on a foundation of enforced human labor, at a scale that makes it just impossible to romanticize life at the top. These people were treated simply as assets, remaining largely invisible in the historical record.
All the slave labor purchased the ultimate elite commodity, time. The Greeks called this concept skol, which interestingly enough is exactly where we get the modern word school. Skol was the extraordinary luxury of existing entirely on your own schedule. You were totally free to debate philosophy, make beautiful art, or engage in high-level politics. But this intellectual freedom, this ability to be fully human in the Greek sense, was a luxury built 100% on the unseen suffering of others doing the actual backbreaking work.
The sobering reality of the ancient wealthy is that it was a life so totally, so theatrically committed to its own performance and so heavily dependent on a brutal hierarchy that it really forces us to look in the mirror. When we strip away the marble togas and the horse-drawn chariots, does modern performative wealth, with its follower counts, luxury brands, and invisible supply chains of labor, really look that different, or does it just have better baths? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I will see you next time.